Hey folks, thanks for joining the Gen X Prof. I am continuing our conversation on ADHD in college. This is video 2, so please feel free, if you haven't already had a chance, to check out video 1, where we talk about some of the issues with ADHD students. What is ADHD? What are some comorbidities and all of that? In this video, we're going to focus on what is ADHD like in college and how does that affect us as professors? How can we make things easier for ADHD students? So let's think a little bit about ADHD as a perfect storm. College is the perfect storm for an ADHD student for two basic reasons. When we think about ADHD, we have higher levels of executive function, and we talked about executive function in our previous video, and we have lower levels of parental involvement. In fact, I think we've spent the last 15 years telling those helicopter parents to stay in their lane, stay on the ground, and let those students sink or swim. Knowing what I know now about ADHD, I would burn down a parent that, because these are students who, because of their lower levels of executive function, actually need parental support more than ever. So I want to back off on that concept. If this is something where you've heard parents say, well, they just need to learn to adult, they just need to learn to figure it out for themselves, please pull back on that concept for your ADHD populations. So ADHD students typically have a lower GPA. They work harder to get that lower GPA. They use fewer study skills strategies because study skills strategies are not always applicable to them. And they tend to be a little less confident in what it is that they know and what they can do. So maybe not taking as many risks. Now, they may need multiple readings of any textbook you give them. Why is that important? Well, because if you are assigning a lot of reading, a student without ADHD may be able to get that reading done in an hour. A student with ADHD may need to read that 2 or 3 times. So they may need an hour and a half, 2 hours, 3 hours. So that small bit of homework that you've assigned starts to multiply for that individual. It's one of the reasons we want to think carefully about our readings and potentially ensuring that all readings have an accessible audiobook. Audiobooks can be a great way for ADHD students to have both a visual and an audio representation of what they're learning, and that's really key for them. So making sure that they have that accessibility. The second thing is difficulty on timed items. Now, for us, when we think of timed, a lot of times what we're thinking of is tests, and that makes a lot of sense. Many times when you get an accommodation letter, which we'll talk about in a moment, tests are one of the things that we highlight. Tests are only one form, though. So timed items could also be things that they have to do in class in a very specific amount of time. So thinking about time in ADHD, what are some of the ways that we can ensure that they have enough time to get their work done? Overall, they will have to work harder for the same grade, given all other things being equal. And that can be very disheartening for a student who feels like they're busting their butt and they're getting a B when they're studying harder and longer and more than somebody else in that class who got an A. All right, so I want you to think a minute. What are some of the things in our classes that might be hard for ADHD students? And we've talked about a few of these. We've talked about time tests, we've talked about handwriting, we've talked about group projects and the need for flexibility, we've talked about deadlines. So think for a second, what are some things in your class that might be tripping up some ADHD students? I'll happily share my list because I've had to really think about this. So my list includes timed exams. Yes, I have timed exams. Timed exams are something that I've always sort of had in my world because students would come in and they would take a test. Now I do them on Blackboard. I do them about the same amount of time. And so I do have to think very carefully about timed exams. Deadlines. Yeah, I am what we call a monochronic person. I love deadlines. I love being on time. If I'm not 10 minutes late, 10 minutes early, I'm late. So deadlines are my thing. I also want to think about textbook readings. I have to think carefully about why do I assign certain types of readings? Is there another option for them to learn the material? Does it provide some type of redundancy with lecture? What does that look like? So I'm thinking very carefully about my textbook readings and how that could be overwhelming. Group work. I do group work. I teach group work. I love group work in the right setting. How maybe do I need to think about my groups for students who have ADHD? What could I be doing to set those groups up for success in a different way? And I'm still working on that. Memorizing. I have moved away from memorization as a big part of my course. I started to test with open book tests about 5 years ago, and I haven't looked back. I've been able to write more deep application questions because I'm not worried about whether or not the students are going to remember a definition specifically or know very, very small bits of information. I'm more interested in can they apply it and use critical thinking. So I've tried to move away from memorization. And then long lectures. I love to lecture. I'm a public speaking professor. It's my thing, but making sure that I'm breaking up my lectures, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So think about your list. Think about the things that might be tripping up students that you want to think about changing. So as we think about our lists, one of the things that I try to encourage people to do is think about the fact that our job is to teach. We're teachers. So whatever we do, it needs to be in the service of a student's ability to learn. How could we teach in a different way that would give more opportunity for our students to learn the material and to demonstrate that learning? And when you think about this, you probably think about it in terms of what we call universal design. How are we designing classes, not just for accommodating students who need an accommodation, but in ways that really benefit everybody at the end of the day? So all the things I'm going to talk about will improve outcomes for ADHD students potentially, but also potentially improve the outcomes for all of our students. The first thing I want to talk about is accommodations, though, because I think sometimes we don't have a lot of experience with this. If these are things that are coming into your classroom for the very first time, you haven't had a lot of accommodations in your life, you may not understand them very well. And I can understand that. It can be confusing. But let's be clear, accommodations are not optional. They are required under the Americans with Disability Act, the ADA. So when a student comes to you with a set of accommodations, it's your job to sit down and negotiate and discuss with that student what accommodations are reasonable and what accommodations are not reasonable. That's a conversation that you need to have as a faculty member. So for example, time on an exam, extra time, that's usually considered a reasonable accommodation. That's one that you can apply. And usually that means having a student taking the test at a testing center. In my case, I do my tests online, so they just get an extra set of minutes onto the end of it. So that's one that's pretty simple and straightforward. So you're going to work with your students to determine what is a reasonable accommodation. Now, for some students, they're used to having something called a 504 plan or an IEP. An IEP is an individual education plan. Both of those are really the same thing. In K-12 education, where students come from, they're used to a parent sitting down with the disability coordinator at a school and creating an individual education plan, a 504. That gives them their accommodations guaranteed across the board in every classroom in their school. So they don't have to think about it. The parent has thought about it. The disability coordinators thought about it. The students typically don't have to have a lot of conversations, although I encourage my daughter to. What they don't know is there's no automatic transference of a 504 plan from high school to college. They actually need to go into the student disability office, whatever that's called on your campus, have a conversation with the disability coordinator, figure out what kind of documentation to provide, and then work through the accommodations with each and every faculty member. If they don't know they need to do that, they could miss an entire semester or more without their accommodations, wondering why they're not getting them. So it's one of the reasons we need to be really proactive in talking to students about getting their accommodations, about ADHD and other disabilities, and our willingness and openness to help them through this process. So that's really important when we think about accommodations. It has to go beyond, well, I didn't get a letter, into I didn't get a letter. If you need accommodations, please make sure that you're following the steps to work with Student Disability Services so that you can get appropriate accommodations and documentation. That simple conversation has gotten many of my students to take that step that they just didn't know they had to take, and made a big difference in terms of their success. So some of the common accommodations for ADHD specifically are breaks and extended time for exams, reduced distraction sites for exams. Remember that squirrel that I talked about in the last video? Well, that's where this comes in. A laptop, a spell checker, and a calculator. These can be really important, particularly for students with dyscalculia, dysgraphia, and dyslexia. So having those little extra technology bits help out a lot. And then note-taking accommodations. Some students will ask to record the lecture. I don't have an issue with that. Some students will ask to have a note taker, or they themselves will ask to have their laptop out to take the notes. They may ask for any notes that you have in advance so that they can keep up with what you're talking about. In my case, mostly that's the PowerPoint slides. So these are very common accommodations that you will see. What we know from the research is that accommodated students achieve higher grades for the most part. So we want to encourage students to get these accommodations. Please don't ever make it sound like, oh, gotta have a meeting with a student about accommodations. Be excited about this. Yes, what can I do to support your learning? How can I help you be successful? That attitude alone makes a big difference in terms of a student's willingness to come to you for support. But accommodations are not enough. They're not nearly enough for a lot of students because we get back to that perfect storm. So much of this is about executive functioning and having a world without parental support for the first time. So we want to think through what else can we do, both in class and out of class. So let's talk those through. We're thinking about in your classroom. This is very specific to you. You're going to know what makes the most sense, but we can always start with our lectures. Most of us lecture too long without a break. Now, I don't want to say we lecture too much because I don't think lecture is a bad thing. I don't think there's a lot of science that says it's a bad thing. And I've been to enough conferences to know that we faculty go and hear each other lecture as a method of learning. So lecture's not evil, but what it is long. And for a student with ADHD, even a student who doesn't have ADHD, listening for an hour is too much. So take a break. Every 15 minutes or so, have an activity that students can do to break up the lecture. So chunking is what this is called. Chunk your lectures. Add movement. Have students walk around the class, move around the class, add in some activities, some guided notes that they could use. What are some of the ways that you can add active learning into a lecture class? It could be as simple as everybody has notes and they compare their notes every 15 minutes. It could be that you ask them to pull their cell phones out and that they check whatever it is that you've put on the board against something that they research. Whatever that moment is, it breaks it up. It gives them a chance to refresh their brain and move forward. Using active learning is really important because it gives some meaning to what you just said. They've heard something and now they need to apply it. If they apply it, they're more likely to have some memory. So whether that's writing, manipulating, doing with hearing helps a lot in terms of memorization. Connecting materials back to assignments. So if you're going to have them write on something, specifically maybe have them write a quick paragraph that would be the precursor to that assignment. So how would we use this in our upcoming assignment? Make sure that you're engaging in problem solving. ADHD is a great superpower in terms of loving to get into things that they care about deeply. So if you make it a problem they want to solve, they will pay massive amounts of attention. They become what we call hyper-focused on things that they care a lot about. So if it's a problem-solving puzzle, they're very likely to be interested. And then explore relevance. That relevance makes the biggest difference for them in terms of whether or not they learn the material and whether or not they remember the material. Out of class, what can we be doing? When we think about out of class, the first thing we have to talk about is assignments. When you're thinking about your assignments, I want you to think about stacking them. If you have created a semester-long project, cut that down into multiple assignments, maybe even 5 assignments, maybe even 1 assignment that's due every week. We love bite-sized chunks. The smaller the piece, the more manageable it seems. And that gets us what the Covey folks call cadence of accountability. You know, as a student, every Friday I'm going to turn something in, even if it's just an update on your project. Whatever the small thing is, it gives you a small bit of success, it keeps you on task, and it reminds you that you have something due. So how could you cut your assignment up into chunks that make it very simple? So if you have a research project, could you have project proposal and then 5 sources and then a hypothesis and then a research question? And so you see how each time you're just having a bit of it. So at the end of it, you're just stacking it all together and applying it into your final paper. The other thing that does is it makes it so no one assignment sinks a grade, so that you don't have something that's worth 50% of a grade or 40% of a grade. So a student can't pass if they make a mistake on that one thing. The next thing you can do outside of the classroom is provide study skills support. When we think about study skills, we think about, well, they need to learn how to write things down, and that's all true. It is something that they do struggle with and they're working on. But we can also do simple things like send due date reminders. Your learning management system has that capacity. Almost all of them do, to send out reminders at specific times to students who still have things coming up or things that they haven't turned in yet. So just sending out a reminder, hey, don't forget, it's Thursday afternoon. We always have something due on Fridays. Please make sure that you've gotten this started. That little reminder can be the difference between, oh my gosh, I didn't do my assignment and I've got it. I'm working on it right now. So just set up a system where you can send out reminders. You don't have to send them out to just ADHD students, send them out to everybody. I benefit from a reminder. Hey, don't forget the deadline for submitting is in 2 days. The number of times that has jolted me into action to submit something to a conference, to a journal, it's a huge, huge help to me. It's probably a help to you. It can be a huge help to your students. The other thing you need to do is help students connect to resources. Don't assume that they know how to do the Easter egg hunt of resource finding on your campus. Not all campuses have really clear indications of what resources are available, where they're available, how they can get a hold of them. Whether it's your library, your writing center, where they can get tutoring support, where the Office of Student Disability Services is. Connect them to electronic resources like Grammarly. I hound students about things like Grammarly and other sites that help them learn the material, because that's what they need to know. Don't make them go play fetch and bring it back. Tell them where it is and help them find those resources. For my own students, I've created a resource page within my learning management system. So here you can see over to the very left-hand side, I've got a support button and it takes them to this link. This link has several bits of information for them that can help them with their ADHD, including how I use my resources to help them. So writing down an FAQ about how you work with students who have disabilities or ADHD specifically can be hugely, hugely helpful. I can tell you, having done this now for a few semesters, the number of students who have come to me and said, you are the first teacher who has really said that this is okay to talk about and provided me with resources. I have just gotten my diagnosis. This really makes me feel like I can do this because I was really feeling overwhelmed. And those conversations made all the difference for me in terms of knowing how important this is, to the point where over the summer, I started working on my own resource page. And so I've created my own website that I will link to here so that other people don't have to go do that resource Easter egg hunt. And it's got some really great things that I think can be incredibly helpful. So let me go ahead and exit to it. And this is my page for students. I also have a faculty resource page here for you as well. And it's got some really useful information on things like body doubling, which is a great study skill where students find somebody to be their study buddy. They don't even have to be in the room with them, but it's your accountability partner. I love Jessica McCabe. Jessica, if you ever see my page, you have made such a difference in my child's life. It has been tremendously helpful to have your videos. Her videos are fun, they're informative, they are heartwarming, and they're short. So they're great for ADHD folks. And her entire library of those is here. Accommodations in college. If you do not follow ADD ITUD, Attitude Magazine, they're phenomenal. And I've got some links to their stuff here. 7 tips for college students with ADHDs, combined learning differences. So those comorbidities we talked about, how to get a coach. 13 tips from grads with ADHD, and executive functioning tips, among other things. So all of this is stuff that I thought would be helpful for my students and things that they have shared that are helping them tremendously. So as we're thinking about this, I want to constantly go back to that concept of shame, that we need to get rid of shame and fear. We would never expect any kind of student with disability to feel shame and fear. And yet, because this one is invisible, you can't physically see it. And because for so many years, so many students were treated the way students were in the 1970s when I was a kid, that they were just hyper and kids who just didn't want to learn and bad behavior, there's still a lot of stigma. There's still a lot of shame and fear and a lot of misunderstanding about it. And so we can start that process of getting rid of that. Please encourage your students then to use the mental health resources on your campus. This means managing anxiety, managing depression, really understanding their self-esteem issues that go with this, and how all of this comes together to support their learning. All right, so hopefully over the last two videos, you've gotten a pretty good sense of what is ADHD, who's affected, how it changes student learning, and then how we as faculty members can change our own attitudes, behaviors, and knowledge to improve student success. These are the sources that I've used throughout. I encourage you to take a look at them and get a better sense of how ADHD is a part of your teaching. And if you need me at any point in time, this is the easiest way to get a hold of me. Thanks for being a part of this conversation. Thank you for being concerned about how to support ADHD students. I thank you not just as a college professor, but also as a mother and somebody whose own kid is going to school in just a few years.